Welcome to our third and final lecture of the week as we continue our discussion of the 1920s. We will take a look at a couple of intriguing developments in the 20s in today's class lecture, beginning with the women's movement and the various political and social changes for women in the United States during the 1920s. And we will then move on to religion in the U.S. during the 1920s, particularly concentrating our attention on Protestant Christianity, because there's quite a bit of changes that are occurring within Protestant Christianity, and that impacted America a great deal on the cultural front, impacting American society. So, let's begin by looking at what changes women were able to benefit from during the 1920s. In many ways, the decade ushered in a new era for women. And I want to start off by discussing political participation for women. As we've mentioned earlier in this semester, voting rights and the franchise, and how that was a major victory for African American men in Reconstruction, and then later how Southern states systematically went about eliminating the voting rights for their African American citizens in the 1890s and the early 1900s through a variety of methods. But through it all, women were not allowed to vote. They did not have voting rights in the 19th century, nor did they have voting rights in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. However, there had been a women's suffrage movement in the 19th century, and that movement reemerged in the 1910s in the Progressive Era. We've talked a great deal about the Progressive Era in this class, and in the second decade or so of the Progressive Era, the right to vote for women became a significant issue. The National American Women's Suffrage Association was the leading group advocating for the right to vote for women, for the franchise. And as early as 1912, they were really trying to push progressive era politicians. That continued as the decade went on, particularly in 1915 when Carrie Chapman Catt became the leader of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. The group began to really push President Woodrow Wilson to support gaining voting rights for women across the country. They presented several arguments for why women deserved the franchise. First and foremost, they argued that women were deserving of the same rights as men, that women were equal to men and were equally capable of making decisions with regards to elected officials and who they wanted to represent them in state and federal offices. And so they really pushed that point. They also pushed other arguments, other narratives, such as the fact that they believed that women were morally superior to men, and that they were willing to support candidates that were more they were, I should say, stronger from a moral standpoint, more godly, for lack of a better term, that they would support candidates who were less likely to involve America in war or any sort of foreign policy disputes that would result in military engagement. And they also pushed an argument that women, and particularly white women, had been passed over for voting rights in the 19th century and in the early 20th century. They believed Carrie Chapman Catt and several of her colleagues publicly stated that white women should have received the right to vote before African American men who got the franchise in the 1870s, and also that they deserved the right to vote before Native American men and before immigrants. We've discussed the waves of immigration in the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s. Most of those immigrant men were, once they gained citizenship in America, were able to register to vote and to vote. And Carrie Chapman Catt and other advocates within the NAWSA basically argued that women had been ignored and passed over, and that it was their time and they were deserving of the right to vote. And in making this last argument, they were more or less adhering to the social hierarchy of the time, arguing that white Americans, including white women, were higher up, or should be enjoy a higher status on the social hierarchy than immigrants or people of color or indigenous people like Native Americans. So there was a bit of a racist or bigoted element to their argument, as it was sort of wrapped up in whiteness and the virtues that come with whiteness. Nevertheless, their multifaceted arguments did persuade Wilson, and Wilson openly supported the 19th Amendment, which passed in the spring of 1919, passed Congress in the spring of 1919, and then it took a little while longer for it to be ratified at the state level, and it was fairly close, but ultimately in August of 1920, the state of Tennessee became the final state necessary to pass, to agree to ratify the amendment, and the 19th Amendment was added to the U.S. Constitution, which gave, I should say, women the right to vote in the 1920 presidential election and in subsequent elections at the state, local, and federal level. It's important to note, as this occurred during Wilson's presidency, that many historians believe that the passage of the 19th Amendment serves as sort of the final political achievement of the progressive era. And we'll discuss next week the political landscape of the 1920s from the as far as the presidential level is concerned. But the presidents that come in from 1920 forward for about a decade or so represent a marked departure from Woodrow Wilson and from Wilson's progressive predecessors, William Howard Taft and Teddy Roosevelt. So this sort of serves as the final victory for the progressive era, the passage of the 19th Amendment and the extension of voting rights and the franchise to American women. It's important to note that when I say American women, we're really talking about white American women at this time, because of the Jim Crow segregation laws that were in effect across America at this time period. So that's a look at the new change, this substantial change in political participation for women. They had their own voice now. They didn't just have to lobby their husbands or fathers or brothers to vote the way that they wanted to. They could cast their own vote and vote however they felt they needed to vote. But there are a number of social changes that take place throughout the 1920s that really influence women in a lot of ways. And we'll move on to discuss those changes. The new woman, I have the second point on this slide labeled that way because that was basically how these young women in America were being portrayed culturally in the 1920s. First of all, women began to join the workforce in greater numbers than previous generations, particularly with regard to working in white-collar jobs, office jobs, teaching positions, nursing positions, jobs that required a high level of education for women to take them, but they were available for women during this time, or I should say they were available for young, educated, middle-class white women, middle-class and upper-class white women. And they, but even with these new avenues of employment, there were limitations. There was a glass ceiling, if you will. If a woman was hired for an office job, they were likely limited to entry-level duties, such as a clerical position or a secretarial type of role. And women that went into education were usually limited to teaching positions at the elementary and secondary school level, but they usually didn't get the opportunity to advance to administrative positions like principal or school superintendent or professor at a college or university. And also there were many nursing jobs open for women at this time, again, educated white women for the most part, but rarely did you see women as physicians, as doctors, and women weren't lawyers in large numbers. Now, I mean, you can always find an exception or two here and there, but by rule, this was the majority of the women that were in the workforce were young, educated white women from middle-class, upper-class families, and they were in these sort of entry-level jobs or mid-level jobs, but there was a limit as to how hard or how high they could go. African-American women frequently worked during the 1920s as well, in many cases out of necessity because they needed to bring home the income for their families. So a lot more families where, husband and wife both worked as African-American men in the South were working in tenant farming type jobs. African-American men in the North and the Midwest were working in industrial jobs in the factories. African-American women were frequently working in domestic service jobs, such as housekeeper for middle-class and upper-class families, or some of the educated black women of this era were accepting jobs teaching in the segregated public schools in black communities. We've talked about Jim Crow laws in great detail this semester and the separate but equal doctrine that emerged from the Supreme Court Plessy versus Ferguson case. That meant in black communities across the U.S., but in particularly in the South, there was an entirely segregated school system, white-only schools, black-only schools, and many of the teachers in the black schools, the K through 12 schools, were black women or black men, as well as HBCUs were prevalent across the country, especially in the South, and in like Washington, D.C. with Howard University, and some places outside of the South, schools such as Wilberforce in Ohio, for example. So women were working in larger numbers during the 1920s, but as I've mentioned, there was no sort of one-size-fits-all where all women could take similar type of jobs. It really depended on your race, your socioeconomic status in terms of what kind of family you came from, and with regards to money and finances, and it also your age mattered a great deal, because many of the young women that worked in office jobs in cities during the 1920s were younger women who were often single women with no children. However, once they married, they were expected to give up their jobs and allow their husbands to become the breadwinner, and they would move toward the domestic sphere in sort of a housekeeping and child rearing role, sort of basically being a housewife. And certainly that's important, but it was limiting at the same time for women who might have had aspirations to have a professional career and have a family. That's something that today is relatively commonplace, but in the 1920s it was expected that women would work, white women would work when they were young, in their 20s and their 30s, but when they got married, they would shift towards a domestic type of job. As far as women that came from white families that were working class or lower income or poor, the types of jobs that those women worked when they were younger, those types of jobs were sort of more along the lines of factory jobs, similar to that we discussed with the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. There was a lot of poor immigrant women who were involved with that, but similar type of jobs of that nature, factory jobs and things like that. But if you compare the overall look of the workplace, whether we're talking office jobs, whether we're talking domestic service industry jobs, whether we're talking factory industrial jobs, and compare it to, say, the Victorian era of the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, you'll find that there weren't nearly as many women working in wage-earning jobs back then. Most of the women back then were limited to a domestic type role, as America was transitioning from agricultural economy to industrial economy. But by the 1920s, that transition had largely taken place, and more people were moving into the cities and urban areas, and many young people, men and women, were moving, after having completed high school or college, and before getting married or starting a family. Going beyond working, let's take a look at social and cultural changes for women during the 1920s. Obviously, being able to work and earn your own income was a significant change for women. They were able to live in apartments and homes in cities and urban areas by themselves without family members or spouses as single women. And that meant that they had leisure time to do activities that they wanted to do. A lot of that involved going out on the town evenings. If they didn't have dates, often they would go to social places like dance halls and cabarets where they could socialize and let loose and meet men as well. And then this is also during the era of Prohibition, so bars and other areas, there was no public drinking available in bars and restaurants, but there was sort of underground illicit places where you could go in cities to drink in spite of the Prohibition restrictions. Those were called speakeasies, and women during the 1920s, frequently, young women in cities frequently went to speakeasies as well. The women of this era also embraced new fashion trends that were much more revealing and much more, for lack of a better term, risque than say what their mothers and aunts would have been wearing a generation or two earlier. If you think of Victorian era in America in that sort of late 19th century or even the first decade of the 20th century, you're thinking of women that are wearing dresses that more or less cover their whole body, and including covering their arms and shoulders. And there's just not a whole lot that is exposed skin outside of hands and faces and those types of sort of full body type outfits. But by the 1920s, women living on their own, making money for themselves, and socializing the way they wanted to socialize, they embraced a fashion that was much more revealing, a lot of sleeveless dresses, and outfits that perhaps showed a neckline and all that. So it was an era where women were far more comfortable, for lack of a better term, of revealing a little bit more of their bodies in public. And partly that was to attract the attention of men that they were interested in, and part of it was just a new way to express themselves, a way to display their personal identity and their personal culture. It's no coincidence that during the same time period, with the fashion trends and with the fact that many of these women were living on their own, that there were far more open sexual norms of the era. In this era, in the last lecture, we discussed the changes in dating and courtship that came with the automobile and the availability of the automobile for regular American families to purchase. And so that meant that romantic encounters between men and women were not limited to supervised dates in the home of the woman's family. Now you could go to these public places in the cities where you lived independently of your family, your parents, and meet men. And so things like casual sexual relationships were far more prevalent in the 1920s than they had been in the preceding decades in America. Also, the gay culture in certain cities, particularly New York City and other like major urban metropolitan areas, flourished during this time, both for both men and women. Lesbian women had more options available to court and to meet women and things like that during this time period. The cultural archetype for this sort of new cosmopolitan woman who lived on her own, worked on her own, and embraced the fashion and sexual norms of the era was known as the flapper. Very popular when discussing the 20s as a whole. And if you take a look at the picture in the upper right-hand corner of this slide, that is an example of what a flapper would look like in the 1920s. And you'll note that the dress is sleeveless, that there's a sort of a headdress or a scarf on there, or a kerchief, I guess you would say, on her head. That was also a very popular fashion accessory of the era, holding an umbrella on perhaps a sunny day in the spring or summer months, and that was what young cosmopolitan women aspired to look like, and often replicated that look during the 1920s. Again, a marked difference from the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, even a decade earlier in the 1910s. You just didn't see young women dressed like that out and about for an evening on the town, or just out and about in the streets on a Saturday late afternoon or early evening. But that became very prevalent in the 1920s. So it was a shifting cultural norm that women embraced, and particularly young women embraced and tried to replicate during this time period. So I want to shift gears a little bit here and move from discussing the new woman, the era of the new woman in the 1920s, and take a look at religion with an emphasis on Protestant Christianity in the 1920s, because there was quite a bit of change going on in American society, and that resulted in reaction from the church and from Protestant Christian leaders in America. First and foremost, there was a significant amount of resistance to the social changes of the 1920s from the Protestant Christian establishment, especially women joining the workforce in greater numbers, and the changing social mores, such as the prevalence of the more revealing clothing that the flappers and the women that imitated flappers frequently wore. And these Protestant Christian leaders were also concerned with the somewhat relaxed attitude toward sexual activity, and particularly in urban America during this time. So a pushback was inevitable, and that's what occurred in the 1920s. As far as women in the workforce, Christian leaders believed that that had the potential to upset the traditional gender roles of a family, and that they believed that women should be wives and mothers first, and working in the domestic sphere at home and not out in the workforce during this time, and certainly they were opposed to the clothing and the nightlife activities of women during this era. Christian fundamentalists in particular announced their opposition to a variety of social changes, including the rise of Catholicism, which was very prevalent in the growing immigrant communities in America, the willingness of young adults to participate in illicit social activities, including drinking alcohol at speakeasies, and the frequency of casual sexual relationships between young people during this time. These were all causes of concern and worry to establishment Protestant Christian leaders. Also during this time period, there was a split within the Protestant Christianity leadership. There was a group of Protestant theologians who frankly believed that it was time for the church and for the Christian leaders to adopt a more modern approach to society, and for them that meant a more secular interpretation of the Bible and Scripture. Basically, this particular group of religious leaders veered away from viewing the Bible literally, or the events depicted in the Bible literally, and rather understood the events that are told in the Bible to be metaphors for how to live life, but not necessarily literal events that happened or literal things that would happen to you if you didn't follow the Ten Commandments or some other biblical guidelines. This same group of modernist Protestant leaders also favored the social gospel, which we talked about before, and particularly they were in favor of trying to find ways to eliminate inequality, both economic inequality and social inequality during this time. So that was one side of Protestant Christianity leadership in the 1920s. The other side opposed this sort of more secular, modernist group of Protestants. And this group basically endorsed a fundamentalist interpretation of the Bible, which involved viewing biblical events as literal truth. They railed against modernity and the social changes that came along with modernity, and they were received financial support from conservative businessmen of the era who did not subscribe to the social gospel, people such as early oil barons Lyman Stewart and his brother Milton Stewart. J. Howard Pugh is another early oil baron of the era that would embrace this sort of fundamentalist evangelical Christianity in the decades to come. And there was a movement that took place during the 1920s called the Revival Movement, and basically what it was a tour of rural America as Christian fundamentalist preachers would travel all across rural America, small towns, mostly in the South and the Midwest, but really anywhere where there was a small town that they could go and set up a tent, and for a few days, it was almost a little bit like a traveling circus, but it was traveling church, if you will. and these leaders would deliver these very serious fire and brimstone type sermons in front of large audiences, basically spreading the gospel of Christian fundamentalism across the rural parts of the country. They steered away from urban America just because it was more difficult to get an audience there, and easier for people, especially media folks, to criticize them or question them. But that was a big event that sort of occurred in the 1920s, the idea of what should Protestant Christianity look like going forward in America? Should it be this more secular, modern view that embraces social change and admits that the Bible is a collection of stories that should be viewed and taken metaphorically as examples to live your life rather than literally? Or is this going to be more of a future that involves more of a traditional fundamentalist interpretation of the Bible? And this was a challenge for the Christian church that would, on the Protestant side, that would continue throughout the 20th century, and in some ways it still goes on today. You have churches that are evangelical Christian churches and churches that are more secular, and they have very different interpretations of Christianity as a whole. And I'm not saying either one is right or wrong, but it's markedly different, in terms of a Sunday in an evangelical church versus a Sunday in, say, a more secular church. And that was certainly the way it was back in the 1920s. Perhaps the most prominent clash between the secular modernist views that were gaining momentum in America during the time and Christian fundamentalism unfolded in a small town in Tennessee, Dayton, Tennessee, in the summer of 1925, with the Scopes trial, also known as the Scopes monkey trial. John Scopes was a young 24-year-old Tennessee school teacher who was arrested in the spring of 1925 and charged with violating the Butler Act, which was a state law that prohibited teaching evolutionary theory in public schools. Scopes had willingly violated that by teaching that evolutionary theory in his classes at a local public school in Dayton, Tennessee. The American Civil Liberties Union, also known as the ACLU, supported Scopes, and Clarence Darrow, one of the nation's most accomplished trial lawyers, volunteered to serve as the teacher's attorney in the trial. On the opposite side of the case was William Jennings Bryan, the former three-time presidential candidate who had lost the presidency in 1896, 1900, and again in 1908. Bryan had, at this point, most recently served as a U.S. Secretary of State during Woodrow Wilson's first term as president. But Bryan served as the lead counsel for the prosecution, basically representing the state of Tennessee in this case. The trial unfolded in the summer of 1925. It was a 6-day trial in July of that year. Spectators packed the courtroom. Media outlets from all over the country, including national radio networks, and H.L. Mencken, one of the more prominent and popular national newspaper columnists, all converged on Dayton, Tennessee to cover the trial, which ultimately became a debate over evolutionary theory and biblical text. toward the end of the trial and the climatic event of the trial, William Jennings Bryan agreed to take the stand as an expert witness for the state, and Clarence Darrow questioned him on the stand. Darrow's questioning style rattled Bryan, the staunch fundamentalist, and even though his testimony was expunged from the record of the trial, it was, uttered in public and over the airwaves of national radio networks and quoted in newspaper columns and articles. And he basically came across as a guy who didn't have the answers to the questions that Darrow asked, which largely centered around, well, if you're a Christian fundamentalist and the Bible is the literal truth and word of God, then how can you explain the idea that the world was created in 6 days or 7 days? Was a day really a 24-hour period, or was a day much longer than that? And that was the type of questioning that Darrow asked in that trial to William Jennings Bryan. The result of the case was the verdict was that Scopes was found guilty and fined $100, which was a pretty substantial amount of money in 1925. However, the verdict would subsequently be thrown out on a technicality. The trial took quite a toll on William Jennings Bryan, who wound up dying 5 days after it ended. He suffered a heart attack or a stroke that a lot of people attributed to the stress of the trial. And the trial continues to have a significant legacy on America. There was a play that was produced originally in the 1950s called Inherit the Wind, that is basically an account of the trial, the Scopes Monkey trial, and that has been made into a couple of movies, a popular 1960 movie, I believe, starring Spencer Tracy and Frederick March and Gene Kelly. I believe that in the late 90s there was a TV movie also of Inherit the Wind, but that's basically the Scopes Monkey trial in the form of a theatrical play / movie. Also, a college was founded in Dayton, Tennessee, the city where the trial took place. It is named after William Jennings Bryan College. Still there today. It's an evangelical Christian college, private school, named after William Jennings Bryan. And a statue of William Jennings Bryan was erected in the town of Dayton, I believe in 2005. And more recently, a statue of Clarence Darrow was also erected in the town. And I believe both statues are just outside the courthouse in the town. It was the very first trial of the century in the 20th century. There would be others that would come along in subsequent decades, although this was the only one that had to do with Protestant Christianity, and particularly evolutionary theory versus creationism. If you take a look at the photo in the upper right-hand corner of this slide here, you can see the two famed lawyers in the case, William Jennings Bryan on the right and Clarence Darrow on the left. The two men had a great deal of respect for each other individually and their respective accomplishments, but were on opposite sides of this trial and very much disagreed over the case itself and what was at stake in the case. Darrow was an agnostic who believed in evolutionary theory. Bryan was a strict, devout Christian who believed in creationism. So that wraps up today's lecture, and I will talk to you again on Monday.